in community, in education, and in politics, on campus, and across the world. Christ in everything. You're listening to Cedar 60.
Hello everyone, my name is Benjamin Mays, and welcome to episode 3 of Cedar 60. This week, we were excited to interview Sandi Wagner on domestic violence awareness and the Christian's role in recovery and prevention. But before we get to the interview, here is a brief review of several important developments from the news this week. First, in the news this week, the coronavirus. As the days until the presidential election dwindle, so does the hope for another coronavirus relief package. And while the White House and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi have made some headway, they have yet to iron out any of the final details for a deal to be made. This week, Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi set a self-imposed 48-hour deadline which expired on Tuesday, but the White House and the Speaker kept negotiating through the rest of the week. As of Friday, the two have yet to reach a full agreement with only 10 days until the election. However, the two sides made some good progress on the subject this week, according to Speaker Pelosi during her weekly press conference on Thursday. The relief package negotiations come as the daily coronavirus case count in the United States surpassed 77,000 on Thursday, breaking the previous record of 75,723 daily new cases set back on July 29th, according to data collected by NBC News. Also in the news this week, the presidential debate. All eyes this week were on the final presidential debate, which occurred on Thursday night. The final debate seemed far more controlled and prepared, with President Donald Trump sparring with Joe Biden, with each candidate allowing the other to speak, as the threat of the new mute button loomed large. However, the debate didn't offer a dramatic or revealing moment that might flip a Trump voter to Biden's side or vice versa, with nearly 49 million people already having voted early. During the debate, Trump repeatedly mentioned Biden's 47 years in public service and repeatedly said the former vice president was, quote, all talk and no action. Vice President Biden, on the other hand, attacked Trump's response of the COVID-19 pandemic, race, and immigration, saying that Trump's handling of the coronavirus made him ineligible to be president again. With just 10 days until Election Day, the question remains, was the debate effective in delivering each candidate's message to everyone or just to each candidate's base? The decision now lies in the American people's hands. And now, here is Johnny Gartner with this week's interview. Thank you, and have a great week.
Welcome back to Cedar 60. My name is Johnny Gartner. Joining us today is Sandi Wagner. Professor Wagner currently teaches in Cedarville's Department of Social Work. She is a licensed social worker in the state of Ohio, a certified forensic interviewer, and co-founder and executive director of First Story House, a nonprofit addiction recovery program based out of Xenia, Ohio. Professor Wagner, thank you for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so this month, I believe, is National Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And specifically this Thursday, Cedarville is doing Wear Purple Day to bring awareness to domestic violence. So I was wondering, just as kind of a getting starter, if you could talk about the month of domestic violence awareness, kind of what their goal is, and then kind of what your position is with relation to domestic violence.
Absolutely. So I'm really grateful to be a part of Cedarville honoring and recognizing this month because it touches so many different families and people. I think a lot of times we think of victims and perpetrators or survivors of domestic violence as in like a marital relationship or, again, certain types of relationships, but that happens in dating relationships too, that power and control. And as a lot of students know at Cedarville, there are a lot of ring by spring relationships moving forward, progressing to next stages, marriages that happen at Cedarville. And I think there is a lot of pressure put on students at a lot of universities and at Cedarville too, to find their person, that now is the time to do that. And you're in the best place of your life to get married and find a spouse. And what we forget to assess, I think a lot of times, is sometimes the risks that are involved and the pressure that we put on people sometimes pigeonholes them into a relationship where they feel like they can't leave. In addition to the power and control that that perpetrator has. So I'm really grateful to be a part of it. Just in the state of Ohio, the deaths from victims of domestic violence have increased by 35% in 2019. And this is an issue that is affecting, if it's not specifically in your family unit in your own home, either friends or members of your church that this is affecting. And since COVID-19 has begun, and it has only increased the amount of stressors put on a family. And now is the time to talk about all of that because we are living it right now.
Yeah. Could you maybe talk about what some of the biggest issues with domestic violence are, like what the most common ones are, but then also maybe some of the least common ones that people don't really think about as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing that typically comes to people's mind with domestic violence is a physical violence. We forget to remember that sometimes it could be financial abuse that a person is holding over or using that to control, that they will only allow a certain amount of their partner, a certain amount of money, or they have to do things in order to get their allowance. It could be emotional abuse or verbal abuse, putting their partner down because of that power and control. And we often, I think, come to the maybe question at some point, why aren't they leaving? And there's an interesting research study actually done by Ohio State University that showed that it's not threats that the perpetrator is having over their victim that is making the victim stay. It's actually more of an emotional and call for their empathy that's pressuring them to stay. So Ohio State it was a really interesting study. They listened in on jail phone calls of whenever a victim had made a police report, and the follow through with that is pretty low. But whenever they would listen to these phone calls, the perpetrator would use that emotional empathy that a victim has to allow that person back into their life. It wasn't a physical threat. It wasn't verbal abuse or more threats that they were going to do things. More frequently than not, it was, I'm so sorry that I did this. I won't do it again. Please forgive me. I can't believe that I hate you. I can't believe that I said those things to you. I promise I'll get help. And that's what makes people stay. And on average, a person goes back to that abusive relationship 7 times before they are finally able to break that cycle.
So could you maybe address kind of what that looks like on college campuses specifically? And I'm sure it might look a little different on Christian college campuses, but maybe also address what the university is trying to do specifically to react to those problems.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So on university campuses, it could look like in a dating relationship, a person trying to isolate their partner from friend groups, that I love you, I care about you so much, I only want you to spend time with me. And that puts a certain pressure on a person, and it makes them feel good too. If they haven't ever had that type of relationship or somebody that cares about them in that way, that emotional support that I wish every child has, but they don't, that's the reality. They want that, and that person who's abusing that knows that. The people who prey on victims like this, they know what's going to keep them to in that relationship. They know what to say. And in dating relationships, I think one of the first risk factors or red flags is that they're isolating you from your friends, that they are the only one, you're the only one who can fill that void. I think a lot of times mental health plays a factor into it too. I'm going to hurt myself if you don't X, Y, and Z. And even on Cedarville's campus, that mental health factor of I'm going to hurt myself or threaten suicide to get you to do things, that's happening on Cedarville's campus. I love to tell my students and even just remind my own self that a lot of parents and friends might think that avoiding talking about something will make it feel like it's going to go away. So parents avoid the topic of sex. They avoid the topic of suicide because they don't want their kids to experience that or go through that. What we fail to realize is that we're probably already thinking about it. We're probably already struggling with depression or suicidal thoughts or struggles with pornography or thinking about having sex or having sex in reality on Cedarville's campus or in other universities. And so we need to start those conversations to help normalize it and reduce the stigma in these situations.
Yeah. So you kind of were talking about that stigma, and our podcast here is kind of addressing political policy issues. And I feel like this issue can be so stigmatized and so politicized. So can you talk a little bit about why it's become such a political issue and maybe what we can do, not just as a church, but broadly as a society to address that?
Yeah. I would love to say that the church is able to care for all of these, not just victims of domestic violence, but victims of abuse, kids in foster care. And that's just not the case. We need the government to assist financially, assist with programs and maintaining those programs and having accreditations and standards to have that like oversight for things. And unfortunately, politicians on both sides and all three sides, independent, libertarian, whatever, they use that in order to maintain their political control. And it took a lot of the funding for domestic violence shelters were actually on the line because the Senate was so bent up on other issues that they didn't pass the funding for the federal funds that domestic violence shelters get. It was on the line for 6 months, but because of other pressing issues, it kind of got pushed to the side. And so a lot of centers, their funding was at risk because that bill was just kind of up in the air. And it's really sad that that's how we're living. And I wish that the church was able to financially provide for all of those things. They're just not. And so people use that in order to maintain their position of power in the Senate, the House, and government in general. It's also the stigma that goes alongside of I am being hurt because we have so frequently thought of this as the choice of the victim to stay in that relationship through generations. We've thought that and heard that. It takes a long time to break that cycle, to break the thinking of the victim is choosing to be here, the victim chose to be in this situation. We just have to start changing that conversation because that puts such a barrier in a victim's mind to come forward and say, I really need help. And my husband, my girlfriend, my boyfriend, wife is verbally abusing me. I think the church also downplays verbal and emotional abuse more than they should. That if it's not physical, that you should stay with your partner, that we should start walking down a path of restoration and towards marital counseling. Yes, but also if things don't change or if there is no growth or fruit from repentance, or if there needs to be a time of separation, I think the church is just really scared to even consider telling their members that, when really separation might help get the help that perpetrator needs. They might need that period of separation in order to seek counseling on both ends separately before coming together as a couple and counseling together.
Sorry. So
You're okay.
certainly bringing awareness like what the university is doing this week is a great way to start addressing the issue. But what can we do as the church as a whole and as specifically individuals to provide the opportunity to have these discussions? Because I may be incorrect in some things, but sometimes it must not be obvious that someone's in a violent or domestic violence is not obvious. So kind of addressing that, like providing an opportunity for them to come forward, even if we don't know about it.
Absolutely. I think you make a really good point, Johnny, that we might not see under what's happening under the surface, that we may think that there are some other issues boiling over, whether marital or with the kids, or even in dating relationships, that your friends have changed because of a relationship. And what we fail to recognize and assess is that there's an underlying issue. So I appreciate you bringing that up because that's very accurate. One of the most encouraging things that I've seen some churches do, and not all churches have the ability to do this, but to have support groups that are just set up in place for people to come, I think is really helpful. And I've seen some churches actually protect victims by calling it just a women's group or a men's support group. But in reality, what they're discussing is domestic violence and how to navigate that, or how to empower those people to find strength in coming forward and disclosing what's happened to them. Because like a lot of, I think every domestic violence site that I have ever gone to, there's a get help now or a leave site now if your spouse or partner walks into the room that you can click, so that way they don't see what you're Googling or researching and trying to get out of that relationship. And the church should take some cues from that we should have kind of an escape button, that if somebody walks into that room, that we're having a normal Bible study, that we are just talking about what it's like to raise teenagers or young kids, to protect them. We need to have that. It's also, I think churches should have a safeguarding committee. A lot of churches have security teams. What I don't see very frequently are safeguarding committees, and that's made up of professionals or people who are trained in the church who say, I will respond if there's a mental health crisis. I will respond if there's a disclosure of abuse. I will respond if there are concerns of domestic violence here and now, or throughout the week that they're on call, where the pastor or an elder can reach out to you and get you involved in a situation, and that you'll respond that week, that day, to people in need. I think we can take a lot of advice and wisdom from what other practices are doing, like different websites and support groups and therapy centers, and bring that into our church to respond well.
And then maybe as
universities
individuals,
too.
And universities talk, like
Right.
Me as a college student with friends who are dating, how to talk about it and how to talk with someone who's in a relationship, and just bringing them the opportunity to talk about it if they need about it.
Yeah, and Christians, especially, not especially, I'll take that back, but Christians are not immune to this in any way. And in fact, I think some Christians use that spirituality. That's one of the things I didn't address, is the spiritual abuse that could come from these relationships as well. That's another element to domestic violence, but they can use scripture to justify what they're doing, and educating them on theologically sound doctrine. If you see friends who are starting to have that power and control over relationships, we should be calling them out in their sin. That doesn't have to be in a rude way. We can do that in a way that's gentle and kind and caring, but we should be calling each other out. I noticed that you did this to her, or you did this to him, or you said this, and it didn't sit well with me. I know I'm not in your relationship, I'm not a part of that, but I want you to know that I care for you, and that it's not sitting well how you talked to her or how you talked to him earlier. And when we look at the guidelines for a marriage in the Bible, it does not apply to dating relationships. And if you are here and listening as a student and you have been told that you need to respect him because that's what the Bible says and you're just dating, I want you to know that that doesn't apply to you. Same with like a work relationship. If men or women use scripture that is specifically set aside for a marriage to make decisions in a working relationship, that's not designed or applied to you. And unfortunately, people take that out of context all of the time to apply it into different scenarios to get what they want.
So could you talk about kind of what we can do as people who are either about to enter into relationships or in relationships, whether that be dating or marriage, to kind of prepare ourselves and look out for this kind of issue popping up? I think it kind of relates to the racism conversation that's happening right now. You know, some people say, well, you may be racist and you don't even know it, and you kind of need to address those psychological things that are happening in your mind. I'm not saying I agree with that or not, but I'm saying, do we need to have that conversation with this as well?
Yeah, absolutely. The first thing that came to mind as you were asking that is our communication skills. Assess your own communication skills. Are you typically passive aggressive in the way that you handle a situation when there needs to be confrontation? Are you uncomfortable addressing certain topics with your dating partner or spouse if you're already married and you're a student or not a student? What can we do to encourage you to address hard conversations and feel safe to have those hard conversations? If you're struggling with anger in a relationship, or I come from a family where if you're the loudest person in the room, you win the conversation. That's not the healthiest in a dating or marriage relationship. And it took a long time to relearn healthy habits and unlearn bad habits that I had from growing up. Nobody likes to be yelled at. You don't typically get your way whenever you yell or shout or scream your point. And it's the same in a relationship, right? So assess your own background and family and how you grew up. How did they handle conflict? And then look at what you want to change from that. We're not just going to push things under the rug or shove things under the rug. I know a lot of people say we're never going to go to bed angry. Well, okay, what does that actually look like? You know, I don't know, because sometimes for my own coping, I need to go to bed and just sleep and think about things a little bit before I can come back and healthily address this in a way that is going to help me love my husband well, respect my husband well, and for him to love and respect me well, that we're in this together as partners and not someone who has power and control and manipulate one another. And I don't think if you're dating somebody right now, I don't think that conversation always needs to happen with each other. That can happen with a mentor. It could happen with a counselor, a therapist, psychologist, not your pediatrician, you guys aren't kids, but your primary care doctor of, I'm having some really big anger issues. Is there something that I can do to help? And then learn coping skills, learn what works for you. If you start to get heated, what is going to help your brain slow down instead of having an impulsivity to act out? What can I do to slow down my emotions, slow down my thinking and my thought process to respond in a better way? One of in my work at Her Story, we have what's called a help me note, because we know when our body, it's for whenever like conflict happens, because we need to relearn again that impulsiveness that our residents typically have. How can we relearn that? Our brain typically responds in like that fight mode or flight or freeze. With our residents, a lot of times it's a fight with our words or physical. And so what we have them do is if they get into that situation, we're going to have you write down everything that just happened before you come and you go off at the cliff with one of our staff of this resident just did all of these things. Because what writing it down does is slows our brain down in order to process things. So if you need to write down what just happened to you, what happened in a situation to slow your brain down to respond better, do that. Learn those coping skills to start to create new patterns in your relationship.
That's really great. Thank you. So I guess kind of as a way to conclusion, is there like books you would suggest for people to read on the issue? And you mentioned earlier like hotlines and websites to go to. Is there resources like that that you would suggest for people who may be listening who are in a situation where they need an out?
Yeah, absolutely. There are a lot of different ones. I'll highlight some local ones. So Family Violence Prevention Center, which is in Xenia, they offer not only housing for emergent situations to get women and children or people who are in an abusive relationship out of that in a safe place to go, but they also offer counseling and support groups. I also want to remind people there is a pressure once you're in a relationship, and I'll just speak to mine at Cedarville, and I'm sure this is happening at other colleges too, to stay in that relationship. And either out of fear that you're not going to find somebody else, or that this is the best that you can do, or there are some times that it's good. There are always times when a relationship is good. But if you start to see a cycle and a pattern of good times followed by something that escalates that relationship, followed by an acting out of that person hurting you physically, mentally, emotionally, or spiritually. And then there's that apology, that emotional manipulation that happens. Start to assess whether or not you're in that cycle, or if there are warning signs for that, and start that separation process now. It's not worth being engaged, or the shame that might come with breaking an engagement. I promise you, your life is worth doing something about that now, that you are not, you are worthy of feeling love and affection that comes from a healthy relationship and not out of manipulation. So I'm sorry, I mentioned Family Violence Prevention Center. Artemis Center is in Dayton, and they offer like even help with getting different cell phones, support groups. They have support groups for children as well if they're have witnessed domestic violence or emotional violence, and support just for them. And then there are a lot of different websites that you can go to. There are hotlines that have web chats and hotlines that you can call to seek help and to talk to somebody 24/7. Even if you are sitting here thinking, I would never call one of those places, it's not that bad. Sometimes it's helpful to I think it's easier to talk to a stranger about some of those things before you talk to maybe some of your closest friends or confidants. That it's easier to come out and say, I think I'm being abused, to somebody who's a complete stranger. I don't know necessarily why that is, but that can be one small step that you take towards healing and towards getting into a healthy place for you and holding somebody accountable for their actions.
Yeah, that's really great. And then I guess just as a last final question, could you maybe talk about ways we can advocate for domestic violence awareness? So, sometimes it seems like things get over advertised on social media, so they lose their pungency, I guess. But what can we do in those venues and in other venues to bring awareness to the issue?
Yeah. As I said earlier, this touches so many different people. There are certain populations, though, that are at a higher risk for being a victim of domestic violence, and we should be highlighting them. We should know that homeless youth are at a higher risk. We should be aware that people who identify as LGBTQ, that they are at a higher risk for being in violent relationships, and we shouldn't just ignore those populations or think that this isn't happening within our churches, that police officers are at a higher rate of having domestic violence under their household, and the fear that victims who may be connected with police or with law enforcement in some way or another, that must put on them to have to report a police officer, knowing that who they're reporting it to is their coworker. We should be calling out that and identifying those higher risk populations, even when it's uncomfortable for us, or even when we might not see that or agree with it. So I think that's one way. The other way is get plugged in. It's really easy to have fear of a population or of hold those stigmas of a population when you're far away. When you get up close to somebody who's in active addiction, when you get up close to somebody who looks different than you or acts different than you, it's really hard to keep those stigmas, because you start to see them and see the journey that they've walked, and you build empathy for them each day that you're with them. So get plugged into different resources in your community, start to volunteer at places, go and answer hotlines at Family Violence Prevention Center. Be the person who answers the phone on a suicide hotline. Get the training and be that person, because getting involved in that way will help you start to connect more with your community and also be the hands and feet of Jesus, like on the ground. And from those experiences, you can build that into your platform of advocacy on your social media accounts, or even in your friend groups, that now this is personal to me. I have something, it hit home to me. And that's what creates change in our hearts, and change inspires other people to change too, is when it hits home for them in their heart when they see it.
Yeah. I think this issue, I think as Christians, we often kind of focus on abortion a lot as the greatest political issue, but this issue just has just as much equal value, because we really do believe that people are made in the image of God, and that they're to be treated like that, and they're equally disregarding human life. So
Absolutely. Agree more.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. Thanks to listening to this episode of Cedar 60. We hope to have you back on next time. Have a great day.